Dear friends, I'm going to take you on a journey into the depths of history. A journey that will take you not only to the flash of swords and the sound of battle trumpets, but also to stories that push the boundaries of faith, hope, and the human spirit. Today, we step into the birth of the Crusades and the epic narrative of the First Crusade. Imagine people living in the dark and cold provincial villages of Europe. Most of them had no other goal but to survive. But one day, a voice was heard. A pope in Clermont made a call that set hearts aflame. Jerusalem, the holy city, had slipped from her hands, and it was God's command to take it back. This call would drive thousands of people into the unknown, sometimes for the sake of faith, sometimes with dreams of booty. But let me ask you this. Did this adventure, which began with the suspicions of an emperor, really end in victory? Or was a completely different story written in the dusty pages of history? To find the answer to this question, gather around the fire and listen to this unique story with me. Let's get started. Dear friends, we go back to the year 1095. Under the gloomy skies of Europe, a world exhausted by wars and famines. The people in the villages were struggling with poverty, and the nobles in the cities were preoccupied with power struggles. But a spark suddenly lit up this dark landscape. In the city of Clermont, words from the lips of Pope Urbanus II fueled both fear and hope at the same time. Here begins the moment that sparked the Crusades. Nobles, clergy, and common people gathered at the Council of Clermont to listen to the Pope's fiery speech. When Pope Urbanus II took the podium, it was as if thunder was rumbling and lightning was flashing. He was not just a cleric, he was also a strategist, a leader, and an orator who could mobilize crowds. In his voice there was both the power of God and the weakness of men. He spoke of the fall of Jerusalem and the Holy Land in the hands of the infidels. "Save our holy cities, save your Christian brothers," he cried. "Seize this opportunity that God has given you. Take up arms and join this holy cause." At that moment, the Pope's words pierced the hearts of the crowd like arrows. His call was not limited to the desire to take back Jerusalem. It was a salvation, a redemption. "You can purify your sin-laden bodies with this holy journey," he said. The gates of heaven would open wide to those who would join this expedition. These words were powerful enough to shake everyone, from the peasant to the count. But remember, dear listeners, this was not just a religious war. For the nobles of Europe, it was an opportunity to gain power and land. For the poor peasants, it was a chance for a better life. In the eyes of the people, the church was at the center of it all. Pope Urbanus II's speech was not only an appeal, but the first step in a revolution that would shape the future of Europe. Was the conquest of Jerusalem a victory in the name of God, or was it a mask for other deeper motives? And who heeded this great call? Were these people who set out from the four corners of Europe really God's army? Or were these expeditions the beginning of a completely different story? Stay tuned to find the answer. Dear friends, let's take a journey back to Europe in the 11th century. It is an age of rising feudal order with its castles, but it is also an age full of contradictions. The power of the landowners rises on the backs of the peasants. There is a complex chain of allegiance between lords and vassals. But this chain is not so strong. A wind of unrest and uncertainty is blowing across Europe. The feudal order regulates people's lives, but underneath it lurks a tension ready to explode. It was against this backdrop of chaos that Pope Urbanus II's call for the Crusades heralded not only a holy war, but also a major change in society. At the time, peasants were struggling with heavy taxes and the hardships of a life tied to the land. Many were doomed to die in the place of their birth, as it was impossible to leave the land without the permission of their lords. The Crusades, however, gave a glimmer of hope to these people. The Crusades, however, gave a glimmer of hope to the Holy Land and win heaven. It was not just a religious duty. It was a search for a new life, freedom, and perhaps a better future. For the peasants, joining this expedition was a way to break the order in which they had been trapped for years. For knights and nobles, on the other hand, the situation was more complicated. The Crusades were not only a field where they could use their lands and remain loyal to their lords, but the ideals of chivalry went beyond being just warriors. The knights wanted to be virtuous in the eyes of the Church and God, to wash away their sins and win heaven. The Crusades were not only a field where they could use their weapons, but also an opportunity to save their souls. It was also possible to gain new lands, glory, and fame. In Europe, there was competition among the nobility due to the growing population, the insufficiency of land, and the inheritance system. At this point, the journey to the Holy Land had both religious and worldly appeal. Economic hardship also increased interest in this call. Trade routes were disrupted, villages and towns devastated by wars. The Church was both a refuge and a source of hope for the people. But this hope had to be supported not only by prayer, but also by action. The Crusades strengthened the power of the Church and reinforced the loyalty of the people of Europe to the Church. In this socio-political turmoil, the Crusades became not only a religious war, but also a quest for salvation. So who played what role in this journey? How did the swords of knights, the hopes of peasants, and the promise of the Church change the course of history? Now, in the next chapter of this epic story, let us begin to trace the first steps to the Holy Land. Dear friends, when we think of the Crusades, knights in shining armor and organized armies come to mind, don't they? But the first scenes of that great story were not so glorious. History is sometimes shaped by epics that sprout out of chaos, and the People's Crusade is just such a story. It was not based on an army organized by lords, nor on a strategic plan. On the contrary, it was the story of a ragtag crowd of poor peasants, greedy adventurers, and ordinary people burning with religious fervor. And at the head of this mob was a charismatic and passionate leader, Pierre l'Ermite. Pierre was a cleric raised in the monastic life, a man of deep faith and powerful oratory. When he heard the call of Pope Urbanus II at the Council of Clermont, he must have felt burdened with a divine mission. He was shouting that the journey to the Holy Land was not just for knights and the rich. God's call was for all Christians. As Pierre traveled through the towns and villages preaching, his words struck a spark in the hearts of the poor. People believed that going to Jerusalem and saving it was not just a mission, but an opportunity to have their sins forgiven and the gates of heaven opened. However, most of these people knew little about war, travel, or strategy. Armed with simple farming tools, they embarked on an adventure in hunger and misery. In the spring of 1096, thousands set out, led by Pierre. This crowd included people from all walks of life, young and old, peasants, women, children, and even a few adventurous knights. But my friends, imagine. They had no proper provisions. Most of them did not even have a weapon fit for battle. Fighting hunger and harsh natural conditions, they often had to plunder villages in their way. This was in stark contrast to Pierre's message that they were on a divine mission. These people, however, were passionate about the dream of Jerusalem. This dream sustained them and enabled them to overcome the difficulties. But, dear friends, this pilgrimage was not as simple as it seemed. When Pierre and his army of people finally reached the territory of the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Alexius I found an undisciplined and hungry crowd. Although Byzantium saw them as a threat to its own people, it chose to cross them into Anatolia to face the Turks. And here, unfortunately, the fate of this army of people was sealed. On Anatolian soil, this disorganized group met the Seljuk Turks and suffered a heavy defeat. Thousands died or were taken prisoner. Pierre l'Ermite managed to survive, but returned with most of his people gone. The People's Crusade may go down in history as a failure, but it speaks volumes for understanding the spirit of an era. To see what people's faith, desperation, and dreams drove them to do, this story should not be ignored. But after such a tragic beginning, what would the real crusading army, organized by knights and lords, do? Let us witness the birth and the first steps of the real crusade in the next chapter. Ah, my friends, we are now stepping into one of those glorious scenes of history. After the exuberant but tragic campaign of the people, the story of the Crusades was entering a new phase. This time the stage was set for knights in shining armor and nobles with heraldry on their banners. Faith and strength, ideals and ambition were coming together to carve a path for themselves on the stage of history. This great transformation began under the leadership of knights and leaders who answered God's call. The call of Pope Urban's cameth the Council of Clermont echoed across Europe. But in contrast to the spontaneous popular response, the nobles and knights took a different approach. Each of these leaders was motivated not only by religious beliefs, but also by political goals. One of these leaders who shaped the Crusader army was Godfrey de Bouillon. Ah, dear friends, Godfrey was not only a knight, but also a visionary. He was a leader who believed wholeheartedly in the ideal of liberating Jerusalem. A commander born in the land of Flanders, cooked on the battlefield. When he put on his splendid armor, he gathered behind him an army full of faith. Together with his brother Baldwin, this army would become one of the most disciplined groups of the Crusades as they set out to defend God's kingdom. But Godfrey was not alone. Another leader from northern Italy, Bouillon, would go down in history as one of the leading figures in this holy crusade. Bouillon was not only a warrior, but also a shrewd diplomat. As leader of the Normans in southern Italy, He was known for both his military and political acumen. His participation in campaigns was not only a religious duty, but also a search for new lands and power for himself. Another notable figure among the knights was Raymond de Toulouse. He was a leader older than the others in age, but superior in experience and wisdom. His close relationship with the Pope, in particular, made him even more important in this campaign. Each of these leaders shaped their armies according to their own beliefs and goals, creating a great united force. Now think about it, my friends. These knights and leaders were joined by soldiers, each from his own region. These armies came from different corners of Europe, spoke different languages, had different traditions, but they were united by a single goal: Jerusalem. Each leader was trying to bring order and discipline to his army, preparing for starvation, disease, and enemy attacks that might arise during the campaign. But of course, the coming together of such disparate groups would at times lead to tensions and conflicts between the leaders, for each of them wanted to win the battle, not only for God, but also for their own honor and interests. Those long journeys. When these leaders and their armies reached the Byzantine Empire, they found themselves on the threshold of a completely different world. Negotiations with Emperor Alexius I started an important diplomatic process for the passage of these armies into Anatolia. Alexius had to steer this powerful but dangerous crowd in the direction of his own interests. And so the Crusader armies began their march into Anatolia, seeking both the kingdom of God and their own destiny. But friends, was this united Crusader army really disciplined and strong? Or was it a fragile organization, led by a group of leaders with different interests and personal ambitions? How would their first great test on Anatolian soil turn out? In the next episode, we will witness the first encounters of this great army. My dear friends, our journey now takes us from Europe to the east, to the then glorious capital of Constantinople, Istanbul as we know it today. Close your eyes and imagine Hagia Sophia with its golden domes gleaming in the sunlight, footsteps echoing through the marble-paved streets, and the splendor of the Eastern Roman Empire. When the Crusaders arrived in this fascinating city, they felt a sense of unease, mixed with admiration. Constantinople was both an ally and a test. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus watched the arrival of the Crusaders carefully. Alexius was a brilliant diplomat and strategist, as well as a warrior. This emperor, who saw himself as the protector of Eastern Rome, saw the Crusades as an opportunity. But he also knew that they could be a great threat. On the one hand, these large armies from Europe could be useful in reclaiming the lands Byzantium had lost to the Turks. But on the other hand, they could become an uncontrollable force. For this reason, Alexios opted for a cautious alliance with the Crusader leaders. Now, imagine that period. These different factions were gathered at the gates of Constantinople, each under the banner of their own leader. Godfrey de Bouillon, Raymond de Toulouse, Bohemond. Each of them expected to be welcomed at the court of Alexius and to negotiate the terms of the alliance. But mistrust prevailed among these leaders. The Crusaders were not sure whether the Byzantines saw them as true allies or were merely using them for their own ends. Likewise, Alexius was skeptical of the loyalty of these foreign soldiers, These armies were fighting not only for Jerusalem, but sometimes for their own ambitions and interests. And one by one, Alexios invited the Crusader leaders to his palace. In a palace of dazzling splendor, he made each of them swear allegiance. The Crusader leaders promised to return the Byzantine lands to Alexios when they regained them. But my friends, how sincere were these oaths? This would be a question debated throughout history. Alexios also promised to provide the Crusaders with guides and food, hoping that in return the Crusaders would not harm Byzantium. But this was never an easy deal. Tensions were exacerbated by the lack of discipline shown by the Crusader armies as they marched through Byzantine territory. Some knights plundered Byzantine villages and robbed the people of their property. Such behavior undermined Alexios's trust in the Crusaders and damaged the alliance. On the other hand, the Crusader leaders complained that Alexios was not giving them enough support. This complex relationship involved both cooperation towards a common goal and conflicts born of mutual distrust. Think about it, my friends. A military campaign of this magnitude might have been more successful if it had been based entirely on trust. But herein lies the irony of history. These two sides, united against a common enemy, were also wary and distant from each other. Did Alexios abandon the Crusader armies to their fate after they had crossed into Anatolia? Or was this an inevitable step that paved the way for the Crusaders to face even greater problems in the East? So, my friends, what did the Crusaders face when they crossed the Byzantine lands and reached Anatolia? How did the first great battle with the Turks change the fate of these campaigns? In the next installment, we will witness the bloodiest and fiercest battles of this saga. Ah, my dear friends, now our journey takes us to the Siege of Nicaea, an important turning point in history. Close your eyes and imagine those hot summer days as the lush green mountains of Anatolia surrounded the stone walls of Nicaea. This ancient city was on the brink of a great battle. This city, which Sultan Kilich Arslan I had now become the common target of the Crusader armies in Byzantium. And here began the great adventure that would shape the fate of the Crusaders. It was the spring of 1097. After a long wait in Constantinople, the Crusader armies had finally begun their march into the heart of Anatolia. The army marched with great determination, the knights' steel armor gleaming, their crossed banners fluttering in the wind. But this was no ordinary march, my dear friends. This was the first great step towards the Holy Land. The Crusaders gathered in camps along the way, gathering around fires at night, telling stories to each other and praying to God for victory. But the first major obstacle they would face would be Nicaea. Nicaea was the Seljuk Sultanate's gateway to the west. Kilich Arslan was busy with another war in the east against the Danismente, and had left behind a weak garrison to defend the city. This was an opportunity for the Crusaders, but the city was surrounded by strong walls, and breaching them would not be as easy as it seemed. With the support of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, the Crusaders decided to besiege the city both by land and across Lake Nicaea. The Byzantine navy sent by Alexios I took control of the lake and cut the city off from the outside world, while the Crusader knights camped in front of the city walls. The siege lasted for weeks. While the Crusaders' handmade siege towers and battering rams tried to breach Nicaea's stone walls, the Seljuk soldiers inside continued their tireless defense. Arrows and stones flew from the city walls, causing casualties in the ranks of the Crusader army. However, the Crusaders did not give up. With the strength of their religious faith, the courage of the knights in particular was the talk of the town. The daily attacks on the city gates became a war of attrition for both sides. Then, my friends, the fate of the siege suddenly changed one night. The Byzantine fleet sneaked across the lake and blocked the Seljuk reinforcements coming to the city's aid. This strategic move severely weakened the city's resistance. Nicaea could no longer hold out, both from famine inside and the intensification of attacks from outside. Finally, the gates of the city were opened to the Byzantine forces. But, my friends, there was an interesting aspect to this victory. While the Crusaders waited with triumphant joy to enter the city, the Byzantine army would not let them in. Byzantine army would not let them in. Alexirs took the city, undone by over 5,000 soldiers without even seeing a single corpse, nor really even upholding some. Although the Crusaders felt that the victory had been stolen by Byzantium, this did not stop their eastward march. The fall of Nicaea gave the Crusaders both a moral and strategic advantage. The gates of Anatolia were now wide open, and this filled the Crusaders with even greater ambition for new victories. But, my friends, the path to victory is not always easy. What difficulties awaited the Crusaders as they marched deeper into Anatolia? What tactics would the Seljuks employ against these invaders? To find out, in the next chapter, we will look at the memorable Battle of Dorylion, where the Crusaders met the Seljuks. Ah, my dear friends, we come now to one of the Crusaders' toughest tests in the heart of Anatolia, the Battle of Dorylion. It was not only a battle of the field, but also a test of faith, strategy, and the human will. On our journey, after the fall of Nicaea, the Crusader armies were advancing into Anatolia, but this new land was full of harsh rocks, scorching sun, and, perhaps most challenging of all, the brilliance of the Seljuk Sultan Kilich Arslan. After the defeat at Nicaea, Kilich Arslan was determined to stop the Crusaders in the Anatolian steppes. He had learned from his past mistakes, and this time he was prepared to meet his enemy not directly behind the walls, but in the open field. The Crusaders were advancing in great numbers, but this mass was also a weakness. Kilich Arslan planned his attack by observing the Crusaders' expanding lines and slow-moving caravans. The plain of Dorylion in central Anatolia, near present-day Eskişehir, was to be the scene of this great confrontation. The Crusader army marched that morning divided in two. One group consisted of the more vulnerable vanguard, under leaders such as Godfrey de Bouillon and Robert Cordos. The rear group was guarding the heavily laden caravans under the command of other prominent leaders, such as Bohemond and Raymond IV. It was precisely this separation that Kilich Arslan had been waiting for the opportunity to attack. As the first rays of the sun illuminated the plain of Dorylion, Seljuk troops quietly surrounded the Crusaders. Suddenly, The Crusaders' vanguard was showered with arrows. The Seljuk horsemen seemed to come from every corner of the steppe. They attacked swiftly, using hit-and-run tactics to intimidate the Crusaders. On that day, the Seljuk cavalry, as they shot their arrows, blew like the wind of the steppe and disappeared. This was the style of warfare the Crusaders were not used to. Soon after the battle began, fear and chaos spread through the Crusader ranks. The vanguard in particular was in a hurry to protect the caravan full of women and children. Meanwhile, Kilik Arslan's troops were quickly doing damage, getting around the heavy armor and wall-like shields on which the Crusaders relied. But the real heroes of this story, my friends, were the leaders who fought bravely that day. Godfrey de Bouillon rallied his troops and formed a defensive line against the Seljuk attacks to prevent his army from breaking down. But it was not a defense that could be sustained for long. By the time the Crusaders' calls for help reached the rear army, the vanguard was fighting for its life and death. By midday, Bohemond and Raymond's forces reached the battlefield, tired but determined. The Seljuks began to lose their advantage as the two Crusader armies combined. The Crusaders counterattacked with their combined forces and pushed back the Seljuk lines. The Dori-Leon plain was now filled with cries of victory from the Crusaders. The Seljuk army was forced to retreat after this fierce battle. Kilik Arslan had once again been defeated by the Crusaders, but his resistance had shown how difficult it would be for the Crusaders to cross Anatolia. This victory was not only a military success for the Crusaders, but also a turning point that boosted their morale. Their conviction that their faith had brought them victory was reinforced. But, my friends, every victory comes at a price. In the face of the harsh Anatolian soil and an enemy as powerful as Kilik Arslan, that price would be even higher. What more difficulties would the Crusaders face on their way to the Holy Land? And how would the Seljuks plan to make them forget this defeat? In the next installment, we will continue to tell this epic saga. My dear friends, I take you now to the siege of Antioch, one of the most ordeals the Crusaders faced on their pilgrimage. This siege was not just a matter of military strategy. It was also an epic story of hunger, despair, and faith in a miracle. In this long journey to the Holy Land, the city of Antioch became both an obstacle and a symbol. Because this ancient city stood at the crossroads of East and West in all its splendor. However, this splendor would mean a difficult struggle for the Crusaders. In late 1097, after their victories in Anatolia, the Crusader armies stormed the walls of Antioch. The city was under Seljuk rule and ruled by a governor named Yagi Sian. When Yagi Sian learned of the size of the approaching Crusader armies, he immediately began preparations. The city walls were fortified. Supplies were stockpiled, and calls for help were made to the Allies. Antioch was one of the strongest cities of the time, with natural defensive advantages. But the Crusader armies were fighting for a holy cause, and the city was not just a fortress, but a gateway to the Holy Land. When the siege began, the Crusaders settled in front of the walls with great confidence, but this soon turned into an uphill struggle. The walls of Antioch were much larger than the fortresses they were used to in Europe, and the defenders were doing everything they could to intimidate the Crusaders from within. The Crusaders' morale plummeted, as food supplies quickly ran out. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Hunger, cold, and disease became a greater threat to the Crusaders than the enemy. So much so that some soldiers had to boil and eat grass and even skins to survive. In these harsh conditions, many began to believe that God had abandoned them. But it was at this moment of despair that a miraculous event took place. In January 1098, a man named Pierre Barthélemy, a saint among the Crusaders, claimed that the sacred spear used in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was buried under the Church of St. Peter in Antioch. The news spread quickly among the desperate Crusaders, and a small group began digging for the spear. After days of digging, Barthélemy announced that he had indeed found a spearhead. This event was a turning point. The presence of the spear was interpreted as a strong sign that God was with them, and the Crusaders regained their resolve. As the siege continued despite the miracle, calls for help from outside began to bear fruit. Leaders like Boileau plotted both to open the gates through treachery from within and to capture the city with reinforcements. Finally, in June 1098, the Crusaders captured Antioch in a night raid. However, this victory was not enough for them to breathe a sigh of relief. For soon another army, this time the great Muslim army of Kerboga, came to the city walls. Ah, my dear friends, the city of Antioch may have fallen, but the Crusaders' ordeal was far from over. At the end of this siege, a far greater challenge awaited them. And what miracle would the Crusaders need this time against the army of Kerboga? Would God's grace be on their side once again? The answers are hidden in the next part of our journey. Ah, my dear friends, come a little closer to the fire. For now I will tell you of a struggle that shook the lands of Antioch, of a great victory that tested courage and faith. Close your eyes and take yourself back to those times when war cries echoed everywhere, when thirst and hunger were accepted as fate. The defense of Antioch and the defeat of Kerboga's proud army is not just a battle, but an epic of will, hope, and the twists of fate. Antioch was like a fortress, a test on the Crusaders' journey. Under the control of the Seljuks, the city rose like an impenetrable mountain with its walls. Among the defenders of the city was Kerboga, the abbey of Mosul, aka the commander with an iron will. Kerboga's army was so large, with troops gathered from the east and west, that it is described as almost blocking the sky. With this power, he wanted to crush the Crusaders in front of the walls of Antioch. But there was something as great as Kerboga's glory, his arrogance. And yes, dear listeners, Kerboga was so sure of his victory that he hesitated to act even in those days when the Crusaders were weak. Perhaps fate had already pressed the button to punish this arrogance. Inside, the Crusaders were struggling with despair. Famine reigned inside the city while the besieging army outside was growing steadily. Hunger, thirst, and the fragility of hope. Wouldn't one give up in such a situation? But no, the Crusaders did not surrender. Instead, they embraced a spiritual miracle. The legend of the Holy Spear in Antioch rekindled their hope. According to legend, this was the spear with which Jesus was wounded on the cross. One of them, in a divine vision, pointed out the location of this spear. When the spear was unearthed, the fire that had been dying in the souls of the Crusader army was rekindled. Ah, how strange it is that sometimes it is the meaning of an object rather than its physical presence that brings people to their feet. As Kerboga approached the walls with his army, the Crusaders were preparing for a life-and-death battle. Despite their small numbers, they charged into battle with the strength of their faith. Kerboga's army, though outnumbered, was not united. Betrayals and infighting made this huge force fragile. And on that day, the Crusaders put up such resistance against Kerboga's huge army that the enemy's soldiers were forced to retreat. The arrogance and ill-disciplined army of Kerboga had been crushed by the defenses of Antioch. This victory was not only a military success for the Crusaders, it was also a spiritual victory. The Holy Lands had increased their motivation on the battlefield and had become a beacon of hope. But my dear friends, we need to ask the real question. How would this victory shape the fate of the Crusaders? Could the road to Jerusalem ahead bring tragedy as well as triumph? Let's find out together in our next story. My dear friends, I am going to take you on a journey through the foggy corridors of time again. After the shouts of victory from the walls of Antioch, the journey was not over for the Crusaders. No, on the contrary, the real struggle began now, because Jerusalem, which was sacred in their eyes, was still like a distant dream, perhaps a fairy tale. But you know, the most difficult part of a fairy tale is what happens when it is nearing the end. And the Crusaders had embarked on just such a journey, in a world surrounded by fatigue, hunger, and hostility. They began their march towards that distant city. This long journey was not a triumphal procession, but a struggle for survival. The Crusader army seemed to have recovered after Antioch, but inside there were other problems. Leaders like Howard de W., leaders such as Godfrey de Bouillon, Raymond de Toulouse, and Boyamondo were all heroes, but each was also looking after his own interests. The journey entailed battles not only with enemies, but also with those who sometimes appeared friendly. Regions like Damascus and Tripoli were new obstacles in their way. The approach of the Crusaders to Tripoli caused alarm among the Muslim emirs in the region. These cities were full of stories of the cruelty of the Crusaders, but they also knew that the Crusader army was tired and fragile. Diplomacy and conflict intertwined in these lands. The ruler of Damascus understood that while trying to keep the Crusaders at bay, one must not underestimate their strength. But Tripoli, the city, became an opportunity for the Crusaders, not an obstacle. The local emirs, feeling threatened, chose to surrender or make a deal with the Crusaders. Thus, the Crusaders found a harbor where they could rest their tired bodies and strengthen their armies. But even such opportunities were not enough to ease the burden of the journey. With each passing day, the ranks of the soldiers thinned, and hunger and disease became the army's worst enemy. The difficulties the Crusaders faced as they approached Jerusalem also made them more determined. Jerusalem was no longer a dream, but a distant goal. The capture of the city would be not just a military success, but a demonstration of God's favor to them. But, dear friends, think about it. What would it take to realize such a great dream? Would this journey, which tested their patience, courage, and faith, end in triumph or tragedy? Let's find the questions together in the next episode. Ah, my friends, I will now take you back to that hot summer morning when an unforgettable day on the stage of history took place. The year was 1099. The place was Jerusalem. The sun, shining like a ball of flame in the sky, looked down on the earth to witness the fate of this holy land. The Crusaders had finally arrived in front of the majestic walls of Jerusalem after months of arduous marching, starvation, disease, and fierce battles. This was the last stop on their journey, the ultimate fulfillment of their dream. But the price to be paid for the realization of this dream was heavy, and that price would be paid in blood, sweat, and fire. When the Crusader army arrived in front of Jerusalem, the city walls were standing defiantly. Jerusalem was under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate, and the soldiers defending the city had made preparations, knowing the numbers and determination of their enemies. The city was surrounded by solid walls and was inhabited by Muslims, Jews, and Christians. For the Crusaders, these walls were not only a physical barrier, but also a symbol against which their faith was tested. The siege began. Day after day, the summer heat and thirst became unbearable for both the Crusaders and the defenders of the city. The Crusaders could not get water from rivers or wells, and food supplies were dwindling. But their faith was replacing the dwindling resources. One day, one of the Crusader leaders organized a ritual that took the army 7 times around the city to boost morale. As the Crusaders marched around the city walls in prayer, they said they felt that at that moment the heavens opened and God would help them. Finally, the morning of July 15th arrived. As dawn broke, the Crusaders mobilized for a final assault. A huge tower had been built and was designed to reach the top of the walls. In the first wave of attacks, the tower was damaged by stones and arrows thrown by the defenders. But the Crusaders did not give up. Led by Raymond de Toulouse and Godfrey de Bouillon, the attack resumed. The wooden tower built by Godfrey finally managed to reach the walls. Soon, the Crusaders breached the walls and entered the city. Ah, my dear friends, this is where history turns into a bloody page. After the Crusaders entered Jerusalem, the streets became the scene of a massacre. Muslims, Jews, and even some Christians in the city fell victim to this holy storm. Blood flowed like a river through the stone streets of Jerusalem, and the Christian soldiers reached the Temple Mount. They celebrated their victory by shouting the name of God. But that day was less a victory for humanity than a dark reflection of faith. After their victory, the Crusaders gathered in holy places to pray and give thanks. For some, it would be a reward from God. For others, it would be a tragedy that history would never forget. Jerusalem was now in the hands of the Crusaders. But my friends, could this victory really last? How would the cries and prayers echoing within the stone walls of Jerusalem shape the destiny of future generations? And which leaders would take the stage of history with the desire to reclaim this holy city? Let's search for the answers to these questions together. Now I will tell you the story of a completely different world that took shape after the conquest of Jerusalem. Remember, when the walls of Jerusalem were breached, the streets were filled with cries of victory and heartbreaking wails. After those bloody days, the Crusaders began to think about how they would establish order in this holy land. It was at this point that a name emerged on the stage of history that will be remembered for its charismatic leadership: Godfrey de Bouillon. Ah, my friends, Godfrey. He was not only a warrior, but also an idealist. His leadership marked this holy land as he laid the foundations of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now close your eyes and think. The narrow streets of Jerusalem still bear the scars of war. Destroyed houses, ruined temples, and a search for order. Godfrey, as one of the leaders of the Crusader army, declared himself the protector of Jerusalem. But there's an interesting detail. Godfrey never accepted the title of king. It would not suit me to wear a crown in Jerusalem next to the tomb of Christ, he is said to have said. Instead, he took the title of Guardian of the Holy Sepulchre. Ah, what a humble leader. But, my friends, behind this humility lay a much greater strategy. Establishing a kingdom after the conquest of Jerusalem was no easy task. This new order would not only be limited to governing the Holy Land, it also had to ensure that the Crusaders could maintain a permanent presence in a geography teeming with different ethnic and religious groups. But how? At this point, the foundations of the political structure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem began to be laid. Crusader leaders developed a model of governance inspired by the feudal system in Western Europe. Lands were distributed to various lords and knights. However, this system was slightly different from the classical feudal system in the West. Here, religious ties and military responsibilities were at the center of everything. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was taking shape as both a state and a mission of faith. Under Godfrey's leadership, the Crusaders sought to control not only Jerusalem but also the surrounding areas. Ties were established with other Crusader states, such as Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa. But these ties were not always friendly. Ah, my friends, where there are men, there is always ambition and greed. Sometimes the Kingdom of Jerusalem formed alliances with these sister states. Sometimes it found itself in conflicts of interest. But let us not forget that external threats were the main concern for this new kingdom. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was surrounded by enemies. Muslim states were preparing to regroup against these invaders. Godfrey and his successors had to be constantly vigilant. So castles were built, strong armies were raised, and new soldiers were called in from Western Europe to defend the kingdom. But my friends, no matter how strong an army you had, it was not easy to maintain a lasting order in this holy land. For the war here was not only a clash of swords, but also a struggle of faiths. Godfrey's leadership was only the beginning. After his death, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would evolve in a different direction. How would the new leaders go about protecting this holy land? Would Godfrey's modest style of governance be continued by his successors? Or would greed and ambition lead to greater conflict in this land? Ah, here, my friends, in the next installment we will discover the answers to this question together. Oh, my friends, do you think the Crusaders felt like breathing a sigh of relief after capturing Jerusalem? Oh no, you're wrong, because if taking Jerusalem is a victory, holding it is an art. And this art presented the Crusader leaders with countless challenges and a complex political scene. They had to deal with rising threats from both the east and the south, while at the same time conducting diplomacy to maintain their support from the West. These fledgling Crusader states would have to contend with the sharp swords of the Seljuks and the political acumen of the Fatimids. But the real question was this: was it possible to survive among so many different enemies? The Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader states were always on guard in this holy land. The Seljuks were constantly making new plans to drive the Crusaders away from their lands. I remember it like it was yesterday. These mighty Turks, rising on the legacy of Sultan Meliksa, were known not only for their military prowess, but also for their clever maneuvers. When the Crusaders first encountered their lightning-like warriors on horseback, they froze in their tracks. The Seljuks, however, were not only a military force, but also a forceful force with their Arab allies in the region. Although the Kingdom of Jerusalem had established a strong fortress system, they remained in a constant state of war under the pressure of the Seljuks. But the Seljuks were not the only threat, my friends. The Fatimids, ruling in the south in Egypt, were also laying claim to these lands. The Fatimids followed a very different strategy, both militarily and diplomatically. They preferred not to fight directly on the battlefields like the Seljuks, but to win over the peoples of the region to their side. After all, the dissatisfaction with Seljuk rule among the Muslims living in these lands represented an opportunity for the Fatimids. The Fatimids saw the presence of the Crusaders as a temporary threat to consolidate their supremacy in the Islamic world, but did not prioritize their destruction. Instead, they looked for opportunities to lure the Crusaders into their political game. Caught between these two giant powers, the Crusader states were forced to turn to diplomacy. Support from their allies in Western Europe was not always regular. New expeditions and aid were organized, but it often did not arrive quickly or effectively enough. Crusader leaders were thus forced to negotiate with local populations, sometimes even with their enemies. The new alliances that emerged at this time were both surprising and impressive. Imagine that the Crusaders and some Muslim emirates who had once crossed swords could form an alliance against their common enemy. In these lands, enmity was always shorter than friendship. Of course, we should not forget the Principality of Antioch. This small but strategic state served as a buffer zone against Seljuk threats from the north. The courageous leaders of Antioch sometimes supported the Kingdom of Jerusalem, while at other times they pursued an independent path, prioritizing their own interests. Ah, my friends, there were 1,001 foxes in the minds of every leader during this period. Even among the Crusader states, there was no complete harmony. The Crusader states, such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the counties of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch, had to work together against the Seljuks and the Fatimids, but at times they also competed among themselves. But amidst all these complex relationships and endless wars, would the Crusaders really be able to strike a balance? Or would the order they had established in this holy land be eroded by external threats and internal strife? Ah, these, my friends, are the questions we will pursue in the next chapter. Even behind thick and solid walls, there are always hidden cracks. We will see what consequences those cracks have for the Crusader states. Ah, my dear friends, we have talked and talked about the fierce-pitched battles of the Crusades, the sound of swords groaning beneath the stone walls, the story of the thousands of people who set out on the road with the dream of reaching the Holy Land. But Have you stopped to think for a moment how these campaigns changed not only the eastern lands, but Western Europe itself? Well, that is exactly our tale today. How the blood shed and sacrifices made on the battlefields paved the way for the fundamental transformation of Europe. Listen, there are both lessons and astonishing events in my story. The Crusades were, of course, not just military or religious events. They were like the blood of renewal slowly coursing through Europe's veins. Think first of trade. The long journeys from Europe to the East mobilized not only warriors but also merchants, caravans, and adventurers. European cities that once seemed to have retreated into isolated corners were now being revitalized by the routes opened up by these voyages. The Italian city-states of the Mediterranean in particular, who can forget the charming harbors of Venice or the bustling markets of Genoa, responded to the demands of the Crusaders and amassed incredible wealth. Ships brimming with silk, spices, precious stones, and exotic goods literally rewove Europe's trade networks. This commercial revival went hand in hand with the growth and strengthening of cities. Ah, my friends, think about it. Settlements that were once small villages were now growing into thriving cities along the trade routes. Centers like Paris, London, and Florence became the heart not only of trade, but also of cultural and social transformation. And this new wealth attracted not only traders, but also nobles in the church. The spoils of the Crusades and the income from conquered lands filled the coffers of European nobles and kings, while consolidating the political power of the church. But at the same time, a new class, the merchant class, was rising from the lowest rungs of society. This small spark was the first sign of a change in the social order in Europe. But that's not all, dear friends. The contacts with the East were not only commercial and military, they also brought about a cultural enlightenment. When the Crusaders encountered the rich scientific and artistic heritage of the East, they developed a worldview that transcended their own borders. There was so much that Europe could learn from the fields such as astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy that were flourishing in the Islamic world at the time. The Crusaders were introduced to the works of Islamic scholars and saw Arabic translations of ancient Greek and Roman texts. In time, this knowledge spread to Western Europe, turning into a stream of wisdom that would lay the foundations for the Renaissance. Imagine, Europe, once closed in on itself, was now enlightened by the ideas of the East. The Crusades were a vehicle for this cultural interaction. And more interestingly, these contacts changed not only science but also daily life. Spices arrived on European tables. Architectural styles evolved in different ways, inspired by the East. Even the elegant lines of Gothic cathedrals show traces of this interaction. In addition, carpets, fabrics, and luxury goods brought from the East transformed Europe's cold stone walls into warm homes. Everything from the way people ate to the way they decorated their homes was slowly changing. These indirect effects of the Crusades shaped the soul of Europe for generations. But I have a question for you, dear friends. Do you think that so much transformation, so much innovation, brought hope and vitality to Europe? Or did it open the doors to a new series of conflicts and strife? In our next story, we will talk about how these changes have led to deep political, and religious crises in the Western world. Now think about it. Does change always bring good? Or does it sometimes herald even bigger storms with unexpected consequences? We will discover this together. My dear friends, although waves of joy swept across Europe after the conquest of Jerusalem, the victory sent a deep shock through the Islamic world. Jerusalem was not just a city, but the holy center of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. The loss of this land to the Crusaders caused deep pain in the hearts of the Islamic world. But history never records the victory of only one side, does it? The Islamic world was ready to tell its own story and fight back. And today, we will talk about the story of this resistance, this rebirth. The capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders sparked an awakening in the Islamic world. However, my dear friends, this awakening did not happen immediately. At that time, the Islamic world was in a state of great political fragmentation. Different power centers such as the Seljuks, the Fatimids, and the Abbasids were struggling both within themselves and with each other. In this turmoil, the fall of Jerusalem struck a pain in the hearts of Islamic societies, but it also became a call for unity. These people who felt the pain of losing their land to the bone were filled with determination to reclaim their holy city. But this struggle required strong leadership. It was at this point that one of history's greatest heroes would appear on the scene, Saladin Ayyubi. Saladin was no ordinary warrior. He was a leader of deep faith and powerful vision, known for his justice and mercy. But the rise of this great leader did not happen overnight. His story is the story of a long and arduous journey. As a young man, Saladin fought under the Zengid dynasty, where he honed both his military genius and his political acumen. He grew up under a great commander like Nureddin Mahmud Zengi. After the fall of Jerusalem to the Crusaders, the Zengid family had initiated efforts to reunite the Islamic world, and Saladin inherited this legacy. The resistance, led by Saladin, was not only a military struggle, but also a spiritual crusade. Under his leadership, Muslim communities united around a single goal: to take back Jerusalem. But this unification was not easy. Saladin took political control of Egypt, first by uniting the Fatimid Caliphate, and then by uniting Syria under his rule. In the process, he used his pen as skillfully as his sword. He not only built armies, but also planted seeds of hope in the hearts of his people. In his leadership, the people found a symbol of both justice and resistance. My friends, one of Saladin's greatest triumphs can be seen not only on the battlefield, but also in the way he dealt with his enemies. His compassion and justice towards his enemies made his name revered not only in the Islamic world, but also in Christendom. His diplomatic negotiations with Crusader leaders proved that he was not only a warrior, but also a great statesman. However, the resistance of the Islamic world under Saladin's leadership was not only about recapturing Jerusalem. It was a struggle to regain the faith and honor of a people. And finally, the Islamic armies led by Saladin inflicted a heavy defeat on the Crusaders at the Battle of Hittin. This victory was the first major step in reopening the gates of Jerusalem to the Muslims. But how would the fate of Jerusalem be shaped from this point on? How would Saladin's strategies and his dealings with the Crusaders change the history not only of the Islamic world, but of the entire world? Ah, my dear friends, we will discover the answers to these questions together in our next story. But until then, think about it. Does a leader achieve greatness only by winning a war, or does he become legendary for his justice and humanity? My dear friends, take a moment to relax and listen to a wise man's account of the First Crusade. The First Crusade carved one of the deepest marks in world history, not only with the capture of Jerusalem, but also with the effects it left behind. But these reverberated not only on the battlefields, but also in the palaces and churches of Europe, and in the minds of ordinary people. Let's take a look at how this great crusade fundamentally changed the balance of religion and politics in Europe. Remember, the Crusades began with the call of Pope Urbanus II. That famous call, voiced at the Council of Clermont, was not only the beginning of a military campaign, but also the beginning of a great political move that consolidated the power of the Church. On that day, when the Pope declared that it was an obligation to fight in the name of God, he put the unifying power of religion at the service of politics. And the peoples of Europe, from kings to peasants, heeded the call. The warrior's journey to Jerusalem was not only a desire for individual purification, but also a sign of obedience to the authority of the Pope. This was a time when the political influence of the papacy was at its peak. As the victories of the crusading armies were celebrated across Europe, the Pope was no longer just a spiritual leader, but also a political figurehead. This process also upset the balance of power in Europe. The Pope consolidated his authority over the kings. Feudal lords, already drowning in their own internal conflicts, were now forced to act under the unifying power of the papacy. The spoils of war and the riches of conquest filled the coffers of the Church and led to the rise of new cathedrals all over Europe. The rise of papal authority brought both spiritual and secular transformation, but this power also brought new conflicts and unrest. This enrichment of the Church was to be one of the most important factors laying the groundwork for the reform movements that would begin in the centuries to come. But, my friends, no one at the time could have foreseen that the future would be full of such upheavals. And what about the impact of these victories on the people? That's another story. The capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders was not only seen in Europe as a military victory, it was turned into an epic. Stories told in village squares, chronicles written in monasteries, and frescoes painted on church walls turned this victory into a sacred legend. Ordinary people, imagining the huge armies marching on Jerusalem, came to believe that those who took part in the battle were elevated to the rank of saints. The power of this propaganda was so great that the masses of people in Europe developed an unshakable belief that the Crusades were the will of God. The Church seized every opportunity to reinforce this belief. Every victory was used as a tool to encourage people to join more crusades. But this left deep scars not only within Europe itself, but also in its relations with the East. It is important to remember, my friends, that the Crusades were not only military campaigns, but also laid the foundation for long-lasting cultural conflicts. The enmity between East and West is a lasting legacy of these campaigns. Don't we still feel the echoes of these conflicts today? The states that the Crusaders established in the conquered lands sowed the seeds of deep mistrust between the locals and the Europeans. The Islamic world did not just see the Crusaders as invaders. These campaigns were perceived as an attack on their faith. For centuries, this perception made it difficult for each side to understand the other. Now, my dear friends, this story does not end here. The religious and political upheavals brought about by the Crusades not only increased the power of the Church, but also affected Europe's intellectual, commercial, and cultural landscape. But I would like to ask, was life really better for ordinary people when the Church became so powerful? Or were they the ones who paid the heaviest price for these great campaigns? Let's look for the answer to this question together in our next conversation. Dear friends, today we have traveled with you back centuries to the great stories that echo in the foggy recesses of history. Every step we have witnessed the hopes, fears, dreams, and downfalls of humanity. The Crusades were an era that left a deep mark not only on the bloody battlefields, but also on the hearts and minds of men. From stories of heroism to political gamesmanship, sacrifices born of faith and sometimes ruthless ambition, the colorful yet complex picture of this period is a complex one. And of course, these stories are still with us, and isn't understanding them one of the keys to understanding the world today? But the story does not end here, my friends. History continues to flow like a river that never ends. The battle cries of those days may be silenced today, but their echoes can still be heard in politics, religions, and cultures. The courage of Saladin Ayubi, the hopes of peasants in Europe, the rise of the papal throne, all these details live on as part of this story. We have much to learn from the past if only we listen to what it has to tell us. Now, dear friends, it is time to say goodbye to you in the sweet peace of the sunset. But this is not the end, only the beginning of another story. In our next meeting, we will open another corner of the curtain of history. Maybe we will travel to a new civilization. Maybe we will witness the journey of a hero. Or maybe we will discover a secret that no one knows about, hidden in the shadows of history. Which forgotten hero or great secret do you think might be waiting for us in the next story? We will find the answer to this question next time. Until then, my friends, keep your awareness of history alive, and remember, it is impossible to shape the future without understanding the past. Goodbye. Stay in peace.